Hello, and welcome back to another episode on the Reason Through podcast, a show dedicated to having charitable, philosophical discussions, as well as helping you, the listener, develop and reason through your view. Today's episode, I speak with Dr. Gregg Caruso on his recent work, Just Desserts, Debating Free Will, co-authored by another philosopher, Daniel Dennett. In the episode, we speak on free will, whether we have free will or not. If we don't have free will, what are the ramifications? Meaning, how do we hold people responsible for their action? Is there such thing as moral responsibility? In this episode, Greg outlines his view on free will skepticism, maintaining that we can still have moral responsibility, but just not in the most basic sense of dessert. Links will be in the description below to Dr. Caruso's website, as well as links to his recent work. If you find meaning in what I'm doing, please consider subscribing, sharing, and if you're on Apple, rating and reviewing the podcast, as it shows your support, and I would greatly appreciate it. Without further ado, I bring you Dr. Gregg Caruso. All right, so welcome back to another episode. Today with me, I have Dr. Gregg Caruso. Dr. Caruso, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Yeah, for sure. So before we get started on today's topic, if you wouldn't mind telling our listeners who you are and what you do.
Yeah, my name is Gregg Caruso. I am professor of philosophy at SUNY Corning. I'm also a visiting fellow at the New College of the Humanities in London and an honorary professor of philosophy at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. I work primarily on issues having to do with free will, moral responsibility, punishment, um, public policy agency. I also have worked on moral psychology, philosophy of mind, consciousness. Um, but lately, my most recent work has been trying to cash out and explore the practical implications of my views on free will, which I'm sure we'll discuss today.
This is maybe a big question, but how did you get into philosophy? Is that something that you always kind of wanted to do?
Yeah, so it's one of those stories you kind of never know how to tell or how to even analyze yourself. But I actually started out studying music. I was intending to be a jazz musician, and I went to a college called William Patterson University in New Jersey, which had one of the top jazz programs in the country for sort of small combo jazz, which is what I was into at the time. Um, and I just happened to start taking some philosophy courses as I was, working towards my jazz degree. And I was an upright bass player. um, and I started hanging out with some philosophy majors. I started taking some philosophy courses. I sort of found them really interesting. Started doing some extracurricular sort of reading groups. And sometimes it's a matter of who you fall in with and who your friends become. And so there just happened to be a really good core group of philosophers there at the time. Um, some of them gone on to become professional philosophers and are now scattered across the country in good departments and everything. And so I just happened to be around a really smart group of people who were interested in issues that I found interesting. And so as I sort of went along, I started taking more and more classes, reading more about philosophy. And then halfway through, I sort of realized, well, I have enough credits for a philosophy degree as well. And so it was towards the end that I sort of switched over permanently to philosophy. Um, and then I decided to go to grad school, partly because I didn't know what else to do, partly because some of the people who were right before me had gone on to the City University of New York graduate program. In particular, a friend of mine named Rob Talise and a couple others. And so I sort of just followed them there, thinking it was the smart thing to do. And once I got into graduate school is when, I really realized what professional philosophy sort of entails. Um, but I had already sort of fallen in love with it and the questions. And I found myself, in a program that was really good with really amazing people and started studying primarily philosophy of mind and cognitive science under um, a well-known philosopher named David Rosenthal. And it was only later that I started to get more interested in issues having to do with free will. I thought I was going to write my dissertation on consciousness. Um, but it was towards the end that I had a reading group with another group of sort of graduate students on free will. And we worked our way through what was called the Oxford Handbook on Free Will, which was this massive size book edited by Robert Kane. And by the end of that, I was kind of convinced that I had some issues and some positions that I thought would be valuable to sort of explore. And then I ended up writing my dissertation on free will and consciousness. And so I kind of combine my two interests.
Yeah, very cool. I actually have Robert Kane's. I don't have the Oxford Handbook, but I bought his a contemporary introduction into free will.
Yeah,
Uh,
he's an amazing philosopher. Obviously, we
mhm,
have different positions.
mhm.
He's been a real sort of mentor to me over the years. I'm lucky enough to have gotten to know him and have given a lot of talks alongside him, and have had him as a guest at conferences I've helped organize. He's really a father to this whole sub area, and has contributed perhaps more than any other contemporary libertarian out there, I think.
Yeah, I think in the book that we're going to talk about, you describe, I think in the earlier chapters, that most people kind of have like this indeterminate, I guess, layman's view of like, if I raise my right arm right now, like, well, I'm the one that did it,
Mhm.
outside of kind of causal determinism, I guess, causal things outside of my own control. And so this is a huge question about if we have free will, and if we don't have free will, kind of what are the ramifications of this? So if you kind of want to give us an introduction to your book that just came out, called Just Deserts, and kind of talk about a little bit of the highlights of the book, and yeah, we can go on from there.
Yeah, so this I have two new books out actually. One is the one we're discussing, which is Just Desserts, and it's co-authored with Daniel Dennett, who's a leading figure and defender of what's called compatibilism, which I'll explain perhaps in a moment. Um, the title, though, Just Desserts, some people are like, well, desserts are what you eat after dinner. But actually, the concept of just desserts really refers to sort of the punishment that one deserves. And so it's very closely tied to the issue of free will because I personally define free will as the control and action that's required for a particular type of moral responsibility, which
Hmm.
I call basic desert moral responsibility. It's essentially the kind of responsibility that would make you truly deserving of praise and blame and punishment and reward. In philosophical terms, in a purely backward, non consequential sense. So the idea would be simply because you have done some wrong deed, you should be blamed, you deserve to be blamed or punished. Or simply because you've done some praiseworthy act, you deserve to be praised or rewarded for that act. So the kind of notion is that for me, free will is the control and action that's required for agents to have this kind of moral responsibility, to be deserving of certain types of judgments, attitudes, and treatments, particularly what are called desert based
Hmm.
attitudes like resentment, indignation, moral blame, or what's called retributive punishment in the context of criminal justice. Um, and so for me, right, the debate is about whether or not these basic practices could be justified. And so Dan Dennett is a leading, so the main debate, let me kind of frame it for those who are not familiar with the debate. Historically, um, there have been sort of three major views, and the best way to understand it is around the historical issue of what's called determinism. So, determinism is the thesis that every event or action, including human actions, are the inevitable result of preceding events and actions in combination with the laws of nature. Or put differently, it's the thesis that facts about the remote past, in conjunction with the laws of nature, entail there's only one fixed future. Um, And so the idea was determinism was a byproduct of classical physics, Newtonian physics. And it seemed like the physics of the world, the new science was telling us the world is deterministic in this way. And one of the key questions was, can agents be free? Can they be deserving of praise and blame, punishment and reward? Can they be morally responsible in this basic desert sense if the universe is deterministic, if everything they do is determined by antecedent conditions? Um, and sort of three views emerged. One view was called hard determinism, and that view was the view that determinism is true and incompatible with free will. And the reasoning was often put as, if determinism is true, then agents wouldn't have been able to do otherwise, i.e., they couldn't have done anything different than what they did do, and the ability to do otherwise was thought as a necessary condition for free will. Or it's sometimes viewed as determinism is incompatible with the agent being the ultimate source of their actions, in the sense that um, if determinism is true, the ultimate source of one's actions drain back to all these prior antecedent conditions, including upbringing, past experiences, genetic factors, hereditary factors, societal factors. Um, and that ultimate, if determinism is true, everything we do is determined by these antecedent events. Um, Another view came along, and it's called compatibilism because it's meant to say that these two views can fit, and it tries to maintain that that determinism could be true and agents could still be free and morally responsible. That for an agent to be free in the sense that's required for basic desert moral responsibility, it doesn't have to be the case that determinism is false. It just has to be the case that the agent is the cause of their own actions in some appropriate sense. Um, and then there's one last view called libertarianism, which is not to be confused with the political view of libertarianism. It's a metaphysical view, and it basically says that yes, if determinism is true, agents are not free and not morally responsible. But unlike the hard determinist, the libertarian believes we do have free will. And so it rejects the thesis of universal determinism, and it tries to make sense of a kind of indeterminate free will, a kind of free will where agents are not causally determined by the laws of nature and antecedent events. Um, Let me just, I know going on here quite a bit, but let me just say my own view is sort of a successor of hard determinism. I'm not a traditional hard determinist because I'm sort of officially agnostic as to whether determinism is true as a kind of universal thesis. And that's partly because there are now interpretations of quantum mechanics that suggest at the very lowest level of the universe, the subatomic level, um, there might be some fundamental indeterminacy. Um, Although the final interpretation of quantum mechanics hasn't been written yet. But that one of the leading ways of interpreting quantum mechanics is that there might be some fundamental indeterminacy. So my own view is what I call, following philosophers like Dirk Pirabum, I call hard incompatibilism. And essentially it maintains that we would lack free will either way. It maintains that free will is incompatible with determinism, i.e., free will is incompatible with the causal determination of our actions by factors beyond our control. But it's also incompatible with the kind of indeterminacy that would be required by most of the leading libertarian accounts of free will. So I argue whether or not determinism or indeterminism is fundamentally the case,
Hmm.
we would lack free will. I also have other arguments against free will that are sort of independent and depend upon luck. So in general, I defend a view I call free will skepticism, which basically maintains that who we are and what we do is ultimately the result of factors beyond our control, whether those factors be deterministic or indeterministic, or whether they be the result of luck, because luck is also beyond our control. So who we are and what we do is fundamentally the result of these factors, and these factors are beyond our control. And because of that, agents are never morally responsible in this, again, basic desert sense, the sense that they would truly deserve to be praised or blamed, punished or rewarded, simply for having performed some act. Um, Although I do say in the book and elsewhere that there are other notions of responsibility that might be preserved, but it's only this basic sense that I'm denying.
Yeah, for sure. And so, just to kind of recap all of that, so there are three kind of leading, I guess, answers to about whether we have free will or not. Determinism, and so determinism, compatibilism, and libertarianism. But with determinism, you're saying kind of as like a metaphysical like thesis that the way I kind of interpret it is like a if P then Q kind of thing. So if antecedent causally sufficient conditions, they then P. You're saying that for your view, you're agnostic to where that's happening. Like it will P or will Q, I guess if I say that, if that's correct. So
Well,
like,
so like in a kind of say scientific framework in classical physics, the idea is like, look, like take water boiling, right?
mhm,
Um, if you have on your first part of your equation all the antecedent conditions, how much water is in the pot, how hot is the flame, what's the temperature of the flame, is the kettle made out of glass or stainless steel?
mhm,
Those are all the antecedent conditions. You combine that with all the laws of nature, the laws of physics and chemistry and biology and all of that, the argument would be the water is determined to boil. And not only does it determine the boil, it determined the boil at precisely the moment it does boil. It couldn't have boiled at any other moment. Of course, if you change any of the antecedent conditions, you add a little bit more water, a little less water, it would boil at a different moment. And then the argument is that, well, that's pretty much true of all things in the universe. And if we are just physical things in the physical universe, then we should be subjected to the same deterministic laws as all other physical things in the physical universe. I.e., if your brain activity is just the result of biological interactions and laws of chemistry and electrical charge and chemical exchange and biology and physics, and there's no reason not to think that's true, right? We are just biophysical organs. Um, then brain activity should work in accordance with the classical laws of physics. And but also I add that, look, even if you sprinkled in some random indeterminacy, even if you say that some quantum indeterminacies can percolate up to the level that would affect human action, that's not really going to help preserve free will either, because indeterminate events are no more within the control of an agent than determinate events. So fundamentally, it wouldn't really matter. But it's probably more likely the case that at the level we care about,
Hmm.
determinism holds, in the sense that we're dealing with the macro level world. And at the level of decisions and human actions, and the kind of neuronal activity that would be relevant to free will, generally, not everyone, but generally people think that quantum indeterminacies are screened out at that level. But even if they weren't, my argument would be that it wouldn't ultimately help preserve free will.
Yeah, for sure. So we can tabling, putting that kind of aside, what you're saying for your view is that when we look at kind of child development, uh, upbringing, our interactions with the environment, all those things that kind of shape who we are essentially factors beyond our control. And as a result of that, like if someone performs a certain action, they aren't necessarily truly deserving of whatever punishment or reward that they receive, right? Just to and you're calling that basic desert.
Yeah. Yeah. So basic, because it's not justified on forward looking grounds. Like if I were to say, let's just take a case where like my daughter does something wrong. And you want to punish her. Well, there's two different kinds of reasons you might give. I mean, there are more, but I'll just break it down to two.
Mhm,
One is that, well, she deserves it.
mhm,
She did something bad. She deserves to suffer for that bad thing. That requires a kind of basic notion of responsibility. There might be other reasons, which I call forward looking reasons. Um, like, for example, you might want to punish her so as to deter her from engaging in those kind of behaviors in the future. You might want to take away her a cell phone or give her some kind of penalty, so as to help develop her into a moral agent where she weighs various actions in different ways moving forward. So those kinds of reactions, I would argue, are consistent with the denial of free will, because they're not grounded in the notion that the agent deserves it. Instead, they're grounded in the notion that these types of interventions might help in terms of future safety or reconciliation or moral formation of the agent. Those kinds of reasons might still be in place, but the idea that someone basically deserves to be punished or rewarded or given what is called retributive justice in the criminal justice system, I would argue, presupposes a kind of free will we don't have.
yeah, and I think a lot of people, and I'd like to hear what you think about this. Do you find that a lot of people kind of have that intuition to where, like going back to your daughter example, like no, your daughter does deserve to be punished or whatever action
Oh
that
yeah,
they.
I mean, I think the natural intuition is a retributive one.
Mhm,
I think we are sort of naturally predisposed to believe in free will and moral responsibility. I also think that we have really strong retributive intuitions. Some people, like Bruce Waller, calls this like a strike back emotion. And there might be good evolutionary reasons for this. I mean, in our evolutionary past, right, when transgressors didn't carry their weight within the group, or someone has wronged you or wronged an intimate partner, um, you have a really strong reactive attitude, a really strong retributive impulse to strike back. I wouldn't deny that those are kind of natural emotional reactions. What I would deny is that they are justified and that we should give them weight
Mhm.
in justifying our practices and our policies.
Mhm.
So the fact that I might get angry
Mhm.
if you were to wrong me isn't necessarily on its own good justification for saying, well, we should retributively punish criminals. What you need instead is to argue that that reaction is not only natural but justified,
Mhm.
and that the justification can provide you with grounds for adopting policies and practices that presuppose that agents are responsible in this way.
And it kind of so what you're saying, like when for punishing in like in that kind of way, it's the way you highlight it in the book is that it's backwards looking, meaning that presupposes that the agent could have done otherwise, and the agent is truly responsible for the action that they're performing. That solely just because of the action that they did,
Yeah.
instead of looking at kind of a, I guess, in a holistic way, it's like, okay, well, what's going on within the mind of the person that actually would want where this person is doing this action, and um, um, like what are the factors that are actually surrounding the case to where why this person would even do something like that, or um,
Yeah, I mean, yeah, right. So part of what I wanted to kind of replace this reactive approach with a kind of whole person preventive approach. But one thing you need to do before you get there is kind of see individuals, as you're suggesting, as situated into social circumstances and causal systems, right? So, maybe it's even easier sometimes for people to understand these issues if you leave aside determinism and indeterminism and just
mhm,
talk about luck. But like, think about the fact that the lottery of life is not always fair. You have no ultimate control over who your parents are, what time in history you're born into, whether you're rich or poor, white or black, male or female, whether you have certain abilities, whether those be athletic or intellectual, um, i.e., you have no ultimate control over the initial circumstances. Think about how much that shapes who you are and how you think and how you react to the world, and how the world reacts back to you. Furthermore, you have no control ultimately over other aspects of luck, like um, the luck of who you end up in kindergarten with, or who your first grade teacher was, or who becomes your best friend in second grade, or whether you have an encouraging parent or an abusive father, or whether you come across the luck of a good program, after school program, that gets you interested in something that becomes your career path, or as I was talking about earlier, even in terms of how I ended up in philosophy, the luck of who I met when I went to college, and the luck of meeting those few group of people who ended up inspiring me the desire to read more philosophy. um, and so what I would argue is that all of our actions are subjected to luck, different types of luck. And you might break it down into two main types. One type is called constitutive luck, i.e., the kind of luck that constitutes who you are. So this is the luck that makes you the kind of person you are. This is the luck that kind of makes you have the psychological predispositions that you have, the character traits that you have. And again, those are largely byproducts of how you were raised, who your parents were, how many siblings you have, whether people resolve conflicts with screaming or patience, and all of those things make you into this particular kind of person. And those are factors of luck. The other thing I would call present luck, and these are distinctions I draw from the literature and philosophers like Neil Levy and others. Present luck is the luck that it's around the time of action. So present luck could include the luck of like what thoughts come to you in that particular moment when you make a decision. The luck of what reasons weigh most heavily on your decision. Um, and there's even a lot of literature on how circumstantial factors influence our decisions. So the luck of what color the wall is might influence my mood, which might affect my decision. The luck of whether I'm talking to someone on a park bench or on a suspension bridge, or whether I'm in a um, a dangerous situation or a stable situation could affect my judgments and my reactions, which could affect my decisions. Those are things that I would consider present luck because they're luck that influence the particular moment of choice, not the kind of luck that makes you the person you are. And I would argue that the combination of constitutive luck and present luck swallows all. That is, ultimately, what we do is a result of these factors of who we are as agents and how we deliberate and what makes up our sort of our makeup psychologically and the kinds of things that might influence our decisions at the moment of choice. Um, and I would say that ultimately, then luck swallows all, and that it undermines free will and more responsibility because, again, luck is a result of factors beyond our control. Um, and there's
Mhm.
more to that story in that you could try to counterbalance certain types of experiences, or you come across some bad luck and you react in a certain kind of way. But my argument would be the way you react to it, whether you could overcome it, or whether you learn from it, or whether it teaches you to persevere. That itself is a result of luck. It's a
Mm.
result of your either your constitutive luck or your present luck, or combination of the two.
So just to kind of push back and give, I think Dan, um, what his response to the argument from luck. What I think what he would say is, so it's like I can be aware of the luck now, and but I can, if I have the control over other things. So moving forward, I am aware that I, for example, let's just say had a bad upbringing. This is
Yeah,
how I typically respond to given situations. Now that I'm aware of this kind of this bad luck that's been kind of given to me, I can now have the self control in the way that where I can change either I can change the set course of actions to where I'm not reacting in that way anymore.
yeah,
And I think, and so that's where Dan's, I think, compatibilism comes into play, where he's like, well, hold on, like it matters if I'm aware of the luck, if I know about the luck. Now that I know about the luck, I can then change things. But you don't find that necessarily compelling. Is that
yeah.
correct? Or yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, Dennett's a compatibilist, and so he believes free will is compatible, and desert is compatible with determinism and our actions being ultimately the result of these factors. Um, I'm not convinced for a number of reasons. I mean, in the book, he says something like, he gives this really folksy kind of analogy. He says, imagine a race where someone is given a bit of a head start based on what month they were born in. So your birthday is a matter of luck. No one chooses whether they're born in July or August, or it's just a matter of luck what month you're born in. So here someone's given an advantage based on luck. Everyone else given a disadvantage. And he says this is fundamentally unfair. And his argument, his response is that, well, if it were a sprint, it might be. But life is more like a marathon. It's a longer duration and he says, over the course of the race, luck equals out. Um, and I say bullshit to that. That is, all the empirical literature actually suggests that initial inequalities in life compound themselves over time. They don't equal out. So if you're born into low socioeconomic status or poverty, or into communities of violence, or you're subjected to child abuse or domestic violence early in life, um, those create a kind of bad luck, and those create a kind of set of circumstances that make it much harder to overcome. We know incarceration rates are much higher, and correlate very closely, more closely than anything else, with poverty. Um, and so, if you start actually looking at the outcomes of individuals in their lives, you'll often realize that the results are more the byproduct of circumstances than individual choice or individual free will, I should put it. Now, I will say that Dan is right. I don't deny different levels of control. I don't deny that agents can have more or less control. I don't deny that some agents are suffering from different types of uh, diminished capacities, like severe mental illness. Some agents are perfectly reasons responsive. And those different degrees of control matter. What I would argue is they don't matter in terms of ultimately settling the question of basic desert. They matter in other ways, i.e., they matter in terms of what forward looking threats different individuals will pose, i.e., someone who's suffering from psychopathy is a different type of threat than someone who's reasons responsive. They also matter in terms of what types of interactions you would have with them. Again, if someone is perfectly responsive, the reasons that I could give them good reasons for modifying their behavior, that would be different than someone who's not responsive to reasons or is suffering from Alzheimer's or severe brain damage or some other type of diminishing impairment. Um, so those things matter, but I would argue that they're not going to overcome luck in the sense that if you're a reasons responsive agent and you're aware of certain factors and it makes you more determined to work harder, well, that determination itself is the result of luck. It's the result of your either your constitutive nature, which again is a byproduct of luck, or some present circumstances where someone encourages you, like a coach says, "Get up, keep on going," and that forces you to keep on going. That's present luck. Um, but whether or not you can overcome the initial luck is itself a matter of luck. Um, and so I don't think it's fair to hold people ultimately, deserving in this basic sense for whether or not they succeed in overcoming these initial inequalities in luck, because whether or not they can overcome them are themselves the result of factors of luck.
Hmm.
So you
Yes.
might grow up in poverty and someone else doesn't. Here's a good example. There was a book by, you might know him. He's a TV talking head on MSNBC occasionally. His name is Westmore, and he had this #1 bestseller. I think it's called The Two Westmores. Um, and essentially, it tells a story. It's a sort of autobiographical book that there was another guy in his community. I think it was sort of inner city Chicago. And the other guy's name was Westmore too. So he was named Westmore, and this other guy in town was named Westmore. And he tells the two diverging tales where this guy ends up going into gangs and selling drugs and in and out of prison. And he ends up joining the military, and his whole life goes in this sort of different direction. And he has a very successful career now. And um, you could say, well, that's the result of free will. I would say, no, that's the result of these little interventions, these little factors of luck that can really drastically shape the outcomes of individuals. In fact, in many cases, two people can engage in exactly the same act, and luck could bring about two. Like me and you could both drink a case of beer and get behind the wheel of the car and seek to drive home, and someone walks out in front of the road and we both swerve. You swerve and don't hit the person, and the rest of your life goes on exactly, as it has. I end up swerving but hitting the person. Well, the only thing that differs is not our actions, not our intentions, not our but the outcome, and the outcome was a matter of luck. And yet our whole life has been determined. I end up in prison, or I lose everything, or in a completely different set of outcomes than you, simply because we've engaged in exactly the same act and yet had two different outcomes. So we could see how whether you get caught using drugs or get away with it, whether you end up having someone who intervenes and is lucky enough to try to encourage you, whether or not you meet a recruiting agent at school, or whether or not you um, make a decision to join the military versus join a gang, is going to ultimately result in these different outcomes that snowball over time.
Yeah. So, and I think there's a couple things. One where, so when it comes to given all of that, what you're saying that that's not an that's this is enough to given that there's a lot of luck that's involved, it doesn't justify, the basic desert that you're kind of pushing against. Like in the backward looking sense. So like with Dan, I think the way he characterized his compatibilism in a way where it's like overall he has a consequentialist type of forward looking
Yeah,
system
exactly.
of um,
Punishment.
punishment, yeah, of punishment. But once you're in the system,
Yeah,
it's backward looking to where this person does deserve this because they did the action, and because they did that action, we are justified. And so, but there's also another argument that you have, which is kind of the manipulation argument.
yeah,
Still, like to kind of once again push back against like this basic that backward looking
yeah,
justification.
yeah.
So yeah,
So
if you kind of want to go into that argument a little
yeah,
bit,
so the
and
manipulation argument is an argument that is presented often against compatibilism. Again, compatibilism is the view that agents could be completely determined, and yet we could still hold them as having free will and having more responsibility. So one way to argue against that view is to think about these are kind of what are called thought experiments in philosophy. These are sort of hypothetical, imaginary cases. But the idea is that imagine so if an agent is causally determined to act in a particular way by, say, a team of neuroscientists. Say a team of neuroscientists can directly stimulate your brain through some, say, remote control. Um, and they could causally determine you to act in a particular way, unbeknownst to you, right? That you're being manipulated. Um, then most of us, I think, would think that individuals not morally responsible, um, uh, even if they satisfy all the compatibilist requirements. So let's say, for example, um, some team of neuroscientists mess around at their computer, triggering in you this egoistic desire to kill some individual for personal gain, right? So you make this decision to kill, Fred because you stand to gain some inheritance if Fred dies, and you are egoistic and you want that inheritance. Now, even if you satisfy all the compatibilist conditions, that is, your reason's responsive, um, you don't have an overwhelming obsession with killing Fred, that you can modify your actions in light of moral reasons, et cetera, et cetera. Um, Most of us would have the intuition that the individual is not free and shouldn't be held morally responsible. Then the argument continues and maintains that there's no real relevant philosophical difference between that what's so-called manipulation case and the normal case of determinism. Because in the normal case of determinism, ultimately your egoistic desire would itself be causally determined, not by a team of neuroscientists, but by your upbringing and prior experiences and your whole life's history in the past. And whether it's determined, right? And a compatibilist says that inner egoistic desire is determined. They're not denying that, or at least if it's determined, you could still be free. And the argument for manipulation is to say, look, our intuition is that agents are not free in the manipulation case, but there's no real relevant difference between the manipulation case and the natural case of determinism. So if agents are not free in the case of manipulation, then they're not free and morally responsible in the case of natural determinism. Um, so this could be given in a number of different hypothetical ways. Some people, like Dirk Pireboom, divided into like 4 different cases, starting with this really extreme case of a neuroscientist intervening. Then you have different types of interventions that are more and more similar to natural determinism. And then there's the last case, which is just natural determinism. And they say, look, there's no real relevant difference between this case and this one and this one and this one. And then finally, this one and natural determinism. And if we're not free in these cases of manipulation, we're not free in this case either. So think about
Mhm.
there's an example by Al Mealy who says, imagine either like a team of angels or some, just like a team of angels or some goddess engineers this individual's life from conception. They control the zygote, the sex cells, the DNA. They control all the initial ingredients that make this individual. And then they control sort of every aspect of this individual's life, like the Truman Show. Who they go to first grade with, who their second grade teacher was, who they become best friends with in third grade, basically who appears on the stage of their life, right? And they engineer this all so that this individual, let's just call her, Sally, robs a liquor store on her 21st birthday. And this goddess or these angels are really good at what they do. They understand determinism. They have these, infinite capacity and intelligence. So they set it all up, all with the initial conditions so that Sally would be determined to rob this liquor store on her 21st birthday. And they're really good at what they do. And on her 21st birthday, Sally robs a liquor store. Most people have the intuition Sally would not be morally responsible and free because, well, these angels or these goddess determined that she would rob the liquor store. And then the argument is, well, what's different in the case of natural determinism? You don't control your zygote, you don't control your sex cells or any of the initial ingredients. You don't control who you went to first grade with, or who your second grade teacher was, or who your third grade best friend becomes. You don't control any of those factors that you didn't control in the first case. So if you're not free and morally responsible in the manipulated case, why would you be free and morally responsible in the naturally determined case when essentially they're identical?
So, I think in response to the manipulation argument, I think that what Dan pressed, I think he pressed multiple things, but one of them was again kind of like, well, is someone going with the Sally case? Does Sally know about that that this
Yeah,
is happening, or like to the neuroscientist, does the person know about the chip in the brain? And if she knows about it, then I think what Dan was arguing is that, well, then if she makes a different choice, so that's like on the 21st birthday, Sally decides to go against robbing the liquor store.
yeah,
I think what Dan was saying, or I think from what I got from that, was that that's what we would call free. She's making a free choice because she's able to override the initial deterministic uh, set of actions that were laid out before her.
yeah,
And
yeah,
then I think he also says too that it's I find it interesting as I'm reading it where there are times where he so there's clearly cases where people are not free, people that are mental illnesses, people born with disabilities, like certainly like their moral competency, let's just say, go with that, has been severely diminished, and they're not free in the sense like where I'm free, where I, outside of everything as far as I'm aware, don't have any mental illness, no um, disability, to where when I'm making those actions, and where when I make an action, I'm doing it out of my own, I guess, free will. And so the way I think I have the same intuition as you, where it's like, okay, well, you take that case and this case where he both grants, one has not free will and one does have free will, but what are the relevant differences? I kind of fall where you had your intuition, where it's like, I don't see the relevant difference. And to Dan, the relevant differences are one, the self control and whether I know, and two, is that as far as I'm aware, so me personally, I don't have any of those other factors, such as I'm morally competent, I'm satisfying all the compatibilist conditions. So yeah, is that a
yeah.
fair
No, I mean,
representation? I'm trying to represent
yeah,
Dan.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I would say a couple of things. I mean, one, I agree with Dan that there are these differences in levels of control. So think about like someone with obsessive compulsive disorder. But let's take a case where just they are germaphobe, and so they have this obsessive compulsive desire to wash their hands at every opportunity. And so every time they pass the bathroom sink or the kitchen, they end up washing their hands. So they wash their hands a thousand times a day. We could argue that we could agree, I think, with Dan that that person has less control than someone who washes their hands who doesn't have obsessive compulsive disorder. And part of the reasoning would be think about in terms of weights of scales. Um, the choice to wash one's hands is determined by the inner psychological weights of their desires and their beliefs. So let's say they believe their hands are dirty, they desire to wash them. Well, the person with OCD, the desire is so overwhelmingly tipped in this direction that the scales just compel them in every instance decide to wash their hands. In the case of someone who's not suffering from obsessive compulsive disorder, the scales are more evenly weighed. And I can acknowledge that there's difference between those types of agents. Nonetheless, I don't think that difference is enough to ground free will and basic desert. Because if you're a compatibilist, you're still agreeing that this you don't control those scales. You don't control the weight of those scales. And to me, they're just a difference in degree. I mean, it's obvious when the scales are weighed like this that you're going to choose to wash your hands because you're there's no other competing desire, and the desire wins out in every instance. But if the scales are even more evenly weighed, that again, you don't control the weight of the scale. You just react to the weight of the scale, and it determines your choice. And so I would argue, Dan wants to only observe the inner weighing aspect, the inner aspect of control, not how one gets determined to exercise that control in the particular way that they exercise it. Whether it's the team of neuroscientists or natural factors beyond your control, if those inner scales are determined, they're determined, right? Um, so think about like I bought this black shirt. Well, I have a lot of black shirts. It's just I like black shirts. I don't know. But let's go back to the moment when I'm in the store. And my wife says, you have all these black shirts. You need to try on some colorful shirts. So she hands me a few in the dressing room, and I go in there, and I want to appease her, so I try them on. Right. Um, Now think about the moment of choice, i.e., the decision whether or not you're going to buy this shirt. So I put on the yellow shirt or the orange shirt, and I look at myself in the mirror. Um, do you control your reaction of how you feel when you see yourself in the orange? No, I mean, I don't control. I look at the yellow shirt on me and I say, "Oh, I feel like a clown," or "I don't like the way it looks," and then I put on the black shirt. "Oh, I like the way it appears," and then I make the choice to choose the black shirt. But do you control your likes and dislikes? Do you control that initial reaction, which is ultimately going to determine how you deliberate and what choice you make? And if you're a compatibilist, you have all of that is determined, whether it's determined by external manipulators or it's determined by natural factors, i.e., how I was raised, what fashion I was exposed to, what climate perhaps I lived in. If I lived in Hawaii or warm climate, I might not wear black all the time. Um, it might have to do with your personality traits, right? Some people personalities are reflected in more colorful clothing, and um, but if you have no ultimate control over your constitutive nature and your reactions and your likes and dislikes and the weight of your desires and your beliefs, and those determine your deliberation, your choice, and then subsequently your action. The argument for manipulation would be, the compatibilist is saying determinism is compatible with free will. It shouldn't matter how those inner scales get determined. You should be giving me a coherent account that agents are free despite the fact they're determined. But we could see in the cases of manipulation that our intuitions go completely the other way. And part of my explanation is that we could simply see the causes in that case. Whereas in the natural case of determinism, we're more predisposed to smuggle in libertarian thinking. We're more predisposed to think, well, maybe those scales are open to me. But that's not what the compatibilist is saying. The compatibilist is acknowledging that no, in both cases, my decision is determined. Whether it's determined by the team of neurosciences triggering me a like of black shirts, or whether it's determined by my upbringing and my habitual preferences for black, it's determined. And so the argument would be you have to show a relevant difference between the different cases, and if there's no relevant difference philosophically, then we shouldn't end up with different, intuitions, and it should carry through to the case of natural determinism.
And so this is a pretty interesting kind of conclusion, right? And I know we've mentioned this before, and I think a lot of worry, maybe I don't want to put words in Dan's mouth, but I think a lot of worry when someone says, okay, well, if this person isn't morally responsible, I think there's a few reactions that people have, right? Which is like, well, who is responsible? That's one like automatic response. And two, kind of, well, what do we do with people that are performing certain actions like criminals? And like, how do we then go about, doing anything about that? And so, yeah, if you want to touch upon that a little bit.
Yeah, so and this is developed in the book with Dennett and Just Desserts, but I now have another book called Rejecting Retributivism, which is a book-length defense of this alternative, and I call it the public health quarantine model. It builds off of work done by Dirk Pereboom and some others, but basically the idea is, well, it has a quarantine component and a public health component, but the quarantine part is pretty straightforward. Um, if I were to come, say, travel to see you in person, and along my travels, I contract Ebola, let's say, and I get to the airport and I test positive, I think everyone would agree that the state is justified in quarantining me, right? And the justification for limiting my liberty would not be that I would not appeal to free will or moral responsibility or basic desert or retribution or giving this person their just desserts. I mean, you haven't done anything wrong, right? You're not morally responsible for having contracted Ebola. The justification for quarantine would be based on the right of self-defense and prevention of harm to others, i.e., would be based on the justification of public health and preventing a pandemic, right? Um, my argument is that we could give an analogous account for the incapacitation of seriously dangerous criminals, i.e., we could justify incapacitating serial killers and child molesters and other violent offenders on the foundation or grounded in the right of self-defense and prevention of harm to others, analogous to the justification we give for quarantine. So just like we quarantine the Ebola patient so as to protect public health, we could incapacitate the seriously dangerous criminal on the grounds of public safety, i.e., again, grounded in the right of self-defense and prevention of harm to others. And you could do so without referencing free will, moral responsibility, basic desert, retribution, any of those notions. Um, However, if you were to adopt this approach to criminal behavior, a number of really important reforms follow. One is I don't see this. Not only do I see this as a non-retributive approach, I see it as a non-punitive approach. I.e., I don't see this as a form of punishment. I see it as an alternative to punishment. By no intuitive sense of punishment do we punish the Ebola patient when we quarantine them. Because punishment typically entails more than just a restriction on one's liberty. Yes, you're restricting their liberty. But punishment, especially legal punishment, tends to also involve a condemnatory component. You condemn the agent, you condemn their actions or their wrongdoing. It typically involves intentionally inflicting harm or some form of harsh treatment. When I'm quarantining the Ebola patient, I'm not condemning them, and I'm definitely not intentionally seeking to inflict harm on them. I'm limiting their liberty as a means of protection. But the secondary effects might be, causing you to restrict your liberty, but that's not the intent to harm you. And I would argue then that the criminal justice system would likewise have to take this non-punitive approach, which would mean that for me, and I write extensively about this in the other book, we would have to rethink what we criminalize, what we incarcerate people for, the length for which we incarcerate them, but also the way we treat them. And so you can justify limiting the liberty of the Ebola patient, but you cannot justify depriving them of their voting rights, stripping them of other basic human rights, dehumanizing them. So for me, the sentencing court can only be justified in limiting the liberty of the say violent offender, but they're not justified in dehumanizing them or stripping them of their basic human rights. In my view, they should retain their voting rights and other basic rights. Secondly, the goal of incapacitation should be rehabilitation and reintegration. So just like when you quarantine the Ebola patient, that's not the end of the story. The state has a moral duty to treat that person and then release them the minute they're no longer contagious. Well, I would argue the same is true in the case of criminal behavior. The goal should be rehabilitation and then reintegrating those individuals. And in many cases, the rehabilitation might just be in the form of work training or access to education. One of the leading causes of crime is the lack of opportunity. Well, you could level the playing field by giving them more opportunities. Over 50% of people in prison in the United States are suffering from a diagnosable mental illness. Many of them would be better served with mental health treatment. A big cause of mass incarceration in the United States is the war on drugs, and either drug possession lands them in prison or underlying addiction issues lead to petty crime, which lands them in prison. Many of those people, in my view, would be better suited with drug treatment than incarceration. That is, the level of threat they pose to society is sufficiently low. These are not violent or violent offenders. These are people who are committing low-level crimes largely due to addiction. Treat the underlying addiction and the threat they pose as almost non-existent. So the model would drastically require reform of the criminal justice system. But one last thing, I also want to move the pendulum away from the myopic focus on punishment to prevention and social justice. So I owe people a story of what do I do with dangerous criminals, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, oh, you're a free will skeptic, you're going to just let criminals run free. I say, no, you could have this incapacitation account based on an analogy with quarantine, ground on the right of self-defense. However, Dennett, I think, is even guilty of this, and many others. They're obsessively focused on punishment. And that's partly because if you see everything through the lens of free will and individual responsibility, it's like when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. When everything is viewed through the lens of individual responsibility, the response to criminal behavior is always punitive. Well, they deserve to be punished. They did it. They're responsible. The appropriate response is giving them their just desserts. What I want to do is to shift the reactive approach to a preventive approach. And part of that is to adopt a public health approach to violence and a public health approach to criminal behavior in general. And what the public health framework does, and many people are now far more familiar with it because of the pandemic, um, but the idea that and when I started developing this model several years ago, it was kind of strange to people's ears because they had no familiarity with the public health system. But the idea of the public health institutions are um, to identify what are called the social determinants of health. So we look at things like, well, what causes high rates of morbidity or heart disease or type 2 diabetes? And often you'll find that they correlate with, say, certain types of communities. Race, socioeconomic status often affects these differences in life expectancy and infant mortality rates. And so you realize that many of these different outcomes in health are the result of social injustices, structural features of society, low socioeconomic status, poverty, lack of access to stable health care, lack of access to housing, um, poor nutrition, educational inequity, exposure to violence, nutrition, environmental health, like exposure to lead in Flint, Michigan, that affects certain communities more than others, usually those in lower economic circumstances. Um, and so I've done a lot of work in the new book, making the case through empirically studying thousands of different studies that the social determinants of health are essentially identical to the social determinants of crime. That the main causes of criminality um, and the main correlates of incarceration are things like low socioeconomic status, poverty, poor access to health care and housing, educational inequity, exposure to violence. Um, and so the appropriate response to criminal behavior would be then to address the circumstances that cause the criminal behavior in the first place. Instead of punishing people, it's like double jeopardy. They got screwed in the lottery of life, and now they're being screwed again by being given their just desserts. But think about this one statistic. I think it's nearly 90%, it's like 87% of women in prison in the United States have been victims of violence. Nearly 90%. That is, they've either been victims of rape, child abuse, domestic violence, sexual assault. And the reason that these correlate with incarceration is sometimes the crimes are done in reaction to their abusers. Sometimes there's an abusive relation that is combined with an addiction, a codependency issue, and that codependency causes the abusive person to force the other person to commit crimes to feed their addiction, their joint addiction. But in other cases, it's simply that people who are victims of violence, women who have been victimized, suffer psychologically from that harm, which causes them, and this is statistically, empirically proven to show, have higher rates of unemployment. If you've been victimized and you've been a victim of domestic violence, it's harder for you to hold a job because that violence is affecting many aspects of your psychology that affect your ability to work consistently, focus consistently, to be reliable. And so, given the higher rates of unemployment, they turn to petty crime and get by. Well, is it just to give these women who are already been abused more punishment because they turn to crime as a result of their abuse? Or is it better to prevent the abuse in the first place? And so when you look into the lives of individuals who are in prison, what you'll often find is that their lives are filled with hardship. There's no clear line between victim and perpetrator. Most perpetrators, most wrongdoers, most criminals were themselves victimized. Almost all of them. And so, like, I have these studies. I have some statistics over here where this is one case of a Boston reentry study that looked at violent male offenders in Boston, and they found that 50% of the prisoners, these males, were beaten by their parents, and 40% witnessed someone being killed in front of their eyes in their community. So imagine someone who is raised in a community of violence, who literally sees people being shot dead in the streets, 40% of them, 50% are abused by their parents, beaten. Um, and then you wonder why they ended up in prison. Well, the best intervention, the best way to do it is to identify these social determinants, target them, prioritize them, and then adopt effective policies for addressing them. And that's exactly what the public health framework is suited to do. It tracks disease like it tracks violence like it tracks a pandemic. It uses epidemiological modeling to track how violence spreads within a community, just like disease and COVID spreads within a community. And you can see that there are patterns to how the violence spreads, and how it's also concentrated in various communities, just like COVID. It's higher in certain communities of race and certain economic communities, partly due to the lack of equal access to healthcare and preventative medicine. And so the best way to address these is to address the social inequalities that give rise to the criminal behavior. And so I think when you're myopically focused on punishment and you think the lottery of life equals out, like Dennett's foot race example, you're less likely to look at that initial inequality in the race as the cause for the outcome, and instead hold them all equally responsible.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I, I I don't know if I have anything much to say on the moral responsibility part because it definitely seems like you. How do I word it? I don't know if this was Dennett's position at all, but it's kind of like so like a criminal. Let's say someone, a person A murders, I don't know, another person, and we do your quarantine model, and we adopt that, and we this guy's the justification is to protect the community, protect the society. This guy needs to be incapacitated for whatever reason. Um, one, do you find that I don't know? See, I don't know. I don't remember if this is Dennett's position, but do you find that doing that to some people is just not enough? Like they want to, like, no, this guy deserves to be this, or like you
Well, yeah,
can't
I
do.
mean, I think the average person thinks it's not enough,
Yeah.
because the average person, I think, especially in the United States, is very much focused on individualism,
Mm,
focused on punitive responses, and we have just a really strong natural retributive impulse. Um, I might even have to fight that in myself at
yeah.
times.
Mhm.
Um, but the idea would be that when you philosophically reflect upon it, is that reaction A, justified, but B, effective? We could see that it's not very effective. We have a very retributive society and a very punitive society. But what is the outcome? Well, the outcome is mass incarceration. The United States has only 5% of the world's population, yet we house 25% of the world's prisoners. That's the largest rate of incarceration known to civilization. No other society in the history of mankind has ever incarcerated that many citizens. We
I think
incarcerate
also.
roughly 700 people for every 100,000. And we're not getting good results for it. We have one of the highest rates of recidivism, i.e., repeat crime. Nearly 80% of prisoners will be rearrested within the first 5 years of release, which indicates to me that the punitive approach that our prison system takes isn't making them better and isn't reducing crime and isn't making our community safer. So, regardless of whether or not you even agree with me on free will, you might think this is a better approach because when you bring people into our prison systems, you strip them naked, you cage them, you control every aspect of their lives, when they sleep, when they eat, when they leave their cell. And that instills a kind of learned helplessness. They don't know, they don't have any degree of autonomy directly in Dennett's notion of control. They're not learning how to be autonomous beings because you're controlling every aspect of their lives. And then when they're released from prison, they don't have the self control to be good citizens. The much more effective approach is to give them the tools necessary that would help them to succeed, but you have to humanize them. You have to provide them with educational opportunities, work training, give them the mental health services that they need, provide them with the social services that would allow them to succeed once they exit prison. But that retributive impulse prevents us from adopting those kind of policies because people think that the prisoners should be given these benefits. But by withdrawing the benefits, we're shooting ourselves in the foot.
So I have two questions. One, or I think one of the things that I think you mentioned in the book is that, like, for example, like in California, right? There's the three strike laws, and you had
Yeah.
mentioned that there was a case, I can't remember the person's name, but where he, according to his the three strike laws, he ended up stealing some videotapes. So he's
Yeah.
not non-threatening.
Yeah.
He's stealing, and as a result of that, that was his third strike, and he got 25 years, I think, or 50 years
I think
of, and
25 to life, maybe.
yeah,
Yeah.
I
But
can't
yeah,
remember
life
the
in
it
prison.
was,
Yeah.
yeah, and it's like, so
Yeah.
it's also changing the policy kind of in that way where it's like, we're not you're not saying that he shouldn't be um, removed from society, right? Like, and so it's not like,
Well, I think in particular, so not all felonies are equal, and
yeah,
not all crimes. Unfortunately, we went in this direction of what we call equal sentencing, and three strikes or outlaws and mandatory minimums. And the idea was partly that the legislative branch, that is Congress and the Senate, thought judges had too much discretion, and that certain crimes demand certain punishments. The problem is that completely overlooks whatever individual threats these people pose, because someone might commit the same crime. Person A might commit the same crime as person B, and impose a completely different threat to society moving forward, in which case maybe no incapacitation is required. I think for very low level crimes like shoplifting, I don't think incapacitation is even justified. And yet you have this weird outcome where this guy gets life in prison in California for, I think, stealing the equivalent of $32 of VHS tapes. At the time, it was VHS tapes. Um, from a Walmart. He hit one Walmart. 3 days later, he hit another Walmart, and he had a prior conviction. And the additional felonies meant that he got life in prison. But the result of that is would be unjustified on my model, because the threat that this individual poses to society could never justify that sentence. Um, the other aspect is also just how racism has affected our intuitions about what just desserts people need to be given. So, when you look at sentencing disparities with crack cocaine and powder cocaine, for many years, up until I think recently, last couple of years, we had what was called the 100-to-1 ratio. So, if you had 1 gram of crack cocaine, the requirement was you got 5 years in prison. To get the equivalent sentence for powder cocaine, you had to have 100 grams of powder cocaine to get the same 5-year sentence that you had for 1 gram of coke, for crack. So this was called the 100-to-1 ratio, and it was in the law. It was the law. There's absolutely no justification for that disparity in sentencing. In fact, there's no pharmaceutical scientific evidence that one is more harmful than another. They both are exactly identical in terms of their pharmaceutical effects. That has been proven and shown in numerous scientific studies. The only explanation is racism. And the idea was essentially that the communities that use crack cocaine were a different shade of skin than the communities that use powder cocaine. And so we criminalized one of those acts far more than the other. And we ended up creating a whole criminal class and a whole criminal structure around that criminalization of organized gang crime in inner cities that ended up being extremely devastating in the Black and brown communities. Where now the incarceration rates are excessively disproportionate for African Americans. Um, and there's no way to say that that could be justified on any notion of just desserts, or of course couldn't be justified on my account for sure.
so one question I have is, so under your model, how would you approach, so someone who doesn't want to be rehabilitated, or doesn't want to go to work training, kind of all the suggestions that you've been making, how would that kind of work under your model?
Yeah, it would depend on what kind of threat the individual. If this was a violent offender
Hmm.
who couldn't be rehabilitated, I do acknowledge that some people have to be continued to be incapacitated.
Hmm.
I'll give you a very real example that actually goes back to the actual quarantine part. Almost everyone has heard of Typhoid Mary, but I'm not sure if everyone knows the case of actual Typhoid Mary. Mary was a essentially a short cook. She worked in various households, preparing foods for wealthy families. And she had a asymptomatic version of typhoid, i.e., like COVID. Some people could carry it, but they don't exhibit symptoms. And every household she worked in, people started dying, because she was giving the families typhoid by cooking the food for them, preparing the food for them. Eventually, after these scientists sort of narrowed down what was the commonality between all these cases in Boston, they realized it was this one woman, Mary. So they tracked her down, and they told her, that she has to stop being a cook. They didn't even quarantine her right away, and she refused. She said yes, yes, yes. She left Boston, moved to a different state, and continued cooking. And again, people started dying of typhoid. The public health organizations tracked her down again. They quarantined her. In her case, they told her that they might be able to eradicate the typhoid by removing, I think it was her kidneys, which were causing the typhoid. I don't know. She refused the procedure, and she refused to give up cooking. She said, if I were to release, I'm not going to stop cooking. And she didn't actually believe she was the cause of it, and said, I'm not going to wash my hands. This was back in either the 30s or 40s or so. So people didn't commonly wash their hands when preparing food. It was, but they knew enough to tell her she needed to do this. They gave her conditions to release her. They didn't want to hold her, and yet she refused all the conditions. She ended up being held in quarantine until she died. And that's a case where it isn't retribution, and it isn't, punishment even. It's simply like, this person is refusing to take any minimal effort to protect the safety of others. And to stop people from dying, we have to hold her, sadly. And I would say that, if there's a case where, you have someone suffering from psychopathy, and one of the hardest cases is psychopathy. I mean, very few rehabilitative methods work with psychopaths. And some psychopaths, some violent psychopaths, will continue to remain a threat to society. I.e., if we release them, they will very likely, high probability of committing another violent crime. We might sadly have to hold these people, even though we hold them in humane ways and don't demonize or abuse them. But I think almost all of us would agree with that in the end. What are you going to do with a continually a person who is remaining a continued violent threat? Now, not all people should be incapacitated. Let's say you're a kleptomaniac and you steal small things from the mall, and I can't really rehabilitate you. Well, I don't think that threat to society, this low-level petty crime, would warrant continued incapacitation. There are better ways to deal with this person, even if they can't be rehabilitated. Maybe monitoring, maybe an ankle bracelet, maybe mandatory supervision or counseling or some oversight. So there might be other limits on liberty you could implement. But because this person's threat, the level of threat they pose is extremely low. There's no violent crimes being committed here. Even if you can't be rehabilitated, doesn't necessarily equal continued incapacitation. It's only those severely violent criminals who can't be rehabilitated that I would advocate have to be continued.
Yeah, 100%. So what you're mainly talking about, especially with the main focus of the book, and kind of like closing remarks, you're mainly pushing it back against what you call basic deserts and this backward-looking sense of justification for why someone deserves to be punished, and you're pushing back on that. So it's not that they're not responsible, but they're not, under your model, they're not responsible in the most basic sense. They're not going to deserve punishment because they just simply perform the action.
Right.
There are other things that are involved that we still that or why we would hold them still responsible, but just not in this like backward looking sense. It's
Yeah,
forward looking.
there's all kinds of notions of responsibility, and most of them are consistent with the denial of free will. So we could still there's no problem with the notion of causally responsible. Just like Hurricane Katrina was causally responsible for the destruction of New Orleans. That's perfectly fine to say, even though we're not talking about moral basic deserved moral responsibility. Typhoid Mary was causally responsible for those deaths, even if she wasn't blameworthy in the basic desert sense. We could also preserve what I call attributability responsibility. We could attribute various traits to individuals and characteristics. We could attribute um, originality to Einstein. We could attribute creativity to Einstein or Miles Davis or some musician or some artist. We could attribute negligence to Typhoid Mary for refusing to wash her hands. And we could attribute these characteristics and traits to them without necessarily saying that they're self-caused and that the individuals are responsible for making themselves into a negligent person or into a creative person or into a diligent person. We could also preserve what I call um, answerability responsibility. And that's a kind of key one where you can engage people in moral conversation, moral exchange, where I could say, when my daughter does something wrong, I could ask her, why did you do that? What were the reasons? You think there's some characteristic or flaw in yourself, jealousy, anger, some other aspect that might have been the cause? Do you think there's things you could work toward improving in yourself that would prevent you from doing that again? So that kind of moral exchange, I think, is consistent with the denial of free will because it's not grounded in basic desert. It's grounded in forward-looking factors like future safety, future reconciliation, future moral formation. And those are perfectly consistent with the kind of free will I reject. So I think that we can preserve most of what we care about. We just need to give up essentially this notion of just desserts and basic desert and the idea of retribution, which is a lot to give up.
Hmm.
But I do think that we could preserve enough of what we need to adopt effective and practical and ethical policies and programs that could be effective both in our interpersonal relationships, but also within public policy and criminal justice.
Yeah, for sure. Well said. Well, Greg, you've been more than generous with your time,
Thank you
and
very much.
we're getting close to the hour mark. Where can people find you? If you know.
I have a website which is just my name, www. Caruso, GreggCaruso .com, I should say. I'm also on Twitter, which is probably the best place to follow me because I post updates and book links. So that's at Gregg D Caruso, so GreggD and then Caruso. And if you go to those, you can find my publications on my website, links to my books, links to previous interviews and videos. So
Perfect. Yeah, and I will leave those all linked in the description for our listeners to check you out.
thank you.
Well, thanks for coming on the podcast, Greg. I appreciate your time and enjoy the conversation.
Thank you for having me.
And that concludes another episode of the Reason Through podcast. See you next time.